Here's a true story called The Bet. Michael had had many dares in his life, but this was one he wished he'd never agreed to. The bet, and there was no going back. He had to do it. His best friend Josh was there to see that he was going to get through with it. After being the butt of so many pranks and dares, he was now getting his own back. It was a warm summer evening, and they sat in the pub drinking and laughing. The last thing Michael had wanted was to get drunk. He had a tent and a sleeping bag for warmth. He hoped it would be enough. They were both 18 and felt invincible. There was £20 riding on this bet, and Michael needed the money. The sky was slowly darkening, and Michael sipped his drink and he had a smile on his face. But he wasn't happy, he was worried. How he had got into this predicament he didn't know. It was the very thing he didn't want to do. Life seemed to have a sense of humour and loved serving up the things that people didn't want, giving them the polar opposite. Finally, they finished their drink and set off. Michael had his sleeping bag in his rucksack and a bottle of. They set off laughing and joking, but inside Michael was scared. He was too embarrassed to admit it, but he hated the dark, and he had read so many ghost stories and seen so many horror films that his imagination was on fire with scary possibilities. Josh thought it was hilarious and kept cracking jokes at Michael's expense. There was no going back, and with each step he was nearer his destination, like a man walking the plank. This is the last bet I make, thought Michael dejectedly, as the first spots of rain fell on his head and the sky turned as black as his mood. Typically, he thought, and he pulled his hood over his eyes, obscuring his angry face. It wasn't going to be easy putting the tent up in this, he thought, dejected. Josh thought of himself as an expert in outdoor activities, but in fact he knew very little. Just what he'd learnt from being in the Scouts, he knew how to pitch a tent. Michael hoped he was right, as the rain fell heavier. The last thing he wanted was to be outside in the rain, with a flimsy, broken-down tent collapsed around him. Finally, they got to the graveyard, and it looked spookier than Michael wanted or expected. He gulped as the moonlight shone on the old crumbling headstones. It felt like I was in a Hammer horror story, as the wind and the rain whipped around him. Josh opened his rucksack and grabbed the bright blue tent as it fluttered in the wind like a sail. They grabbed a corner each, and Michael struggled to hold it steady as Josh hammered the pegs into the soft, muddy ground. Luckily, they were in the corner of the graveyard, and the weather was so atrocious that it was unlikely that they would be disturbed. Only the homeless would be out in this weather, thought Josh.